on its own. We got water poisoning. We got political meddling. Okay, we got a whole heaping load of corporate malfeasance, apathy, vengeance, conflicts of interest. You know, this has got everything. So stay tuned. I assure you this will be of interest. So I focus on atrazine because it's really a microcosm of the problems we face in this country. If you understand what's happening with atrazine, you understand the first half of my talk. You understand why we are so far behind. So what is atrazine? Atrazine is the most, like I said, the most widely used, the most widely found pesticide water contaminant in the US. And it's the second most widely used pesticide in the US. So I'm sure everyone knows of glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup. That is by far the most widely used pesticide in the US and the world. We use about 300 million pounds of glyphosate every year. Atrazine is second. It's number two. We use about 70 million pounds a year, which is quite a bit less than glyphosate, but quite a bit more than most other pesticides. So it has, you know, it takes the number two spot, unfortunately, widely used, banned in 60 countries throughout the world. And, you know, what is the European Union now? Like 27 countries or so. So this is far beyond, you know, oh, it's just Europe banning it. 60 countries throughout the world have banned atrazine, and yet it is our second most widely used pesticide in the US. Absolutely unacceptable. Where do we find atrazine? Well, atrazine is used mostly in the Midwest. You know, quite a bit in the Mississippi River Valley, throughout the southern seaboard. There's quite a bit of use in Delaware, Maryland, basically in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, but very little use in the entire western half of the United States, which is kind of interesting. But it's, you know, if you live in Illinois or Iowa, you are drenched in this stuff, which is really sad. You know, I grew up in Kansas City, so I was in ground zero, you know, through my whole childhood. And this stuff is everywhere. I mean, if it's in the water, it's just in the air, it is just so widely used in the Midwest, it is everywhere. And the reason that's where all the atrazine is used is because there's really only one crop you can use it on, and that's corn. You can look here at the total use of atrazine in this country has stayed relatively constant since the early 90s, and that definitely goes out to the 80s and even the 70s. You know, if there's three things certain in life, it's death, taxes, and we're going to use about 70 million pounds of atrazine each year in this country. A very constant trend. And you can see the yellow part of this line is corn. So 95% of atrazine use in this country is on corn. The few other crops are sorghum, which is a crop that's very similar to corn in many respects, and sugarcane. You know, we do grow some sugarcane here in the US. So corn, sorghum, and sugarcane. That's it. And that tells you why this is where all the atrazine is used, because that's where all the corn's grown. We have about 300 million acres of cropland in this country. 90 million of that is corn. So a quarter of all of our cropland in the US is just to grow corn. And this is not the corn most people think of. That's like corn on the cob you have, you know, in the summertime, or corn chips that you eat or whatever. 99% of the corn in the US is field corn. This is disgusting, hard, chalky stuff that is really inedible. So it's not used to feed people. What it's used for is to make ethanol, to put in our gas tanks as a fuel additive. It's used to feed factory farmed animals a high grain diet. And it's used to make high fructose corn syrup. So only 1% of corn we grow in this country is what most people think of when they think of corn, stuff that you eat. So when I say atrazine is used on corn, I don't really mean corn that people eat. I mean corn that people don't eat. And the same trends goes with sorghum. Almost all the sorghum grown in this country is used for ethanol and to feed animals kept in terrible environments and tortured basically for their entire lives, and then slaughtered so we can have meat. And sugarcane is, of course, just sugar. It's mainly used for processed food. It's not really food. It just makes food more palatable for some people. So the reason I go into that is because I want to make it clear that almost every single drop of atrazine used in this country is for fuel, to feed factory farmed animals, and for processed food. It is not used to make nutritious food for people to eat. It's just not. And the whole trope of, oh, pesticides are needed to feed the world is, it's a bunch of baloney, first of all, but it is absolutely inaccurate when we talk about atrazine, because atrazine is not used on human food. It's used on these other things. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Where do we find atrazine? Well, the good news is, since atrazine is not used on food, we don't find it in food. So, I guess there's a silver lining to everything, right? But we find it in the water. Atrazine it goes where the water is. Wherever you apply atrazine, at some point, it will find the water, and that's where it's going to stay. It doesn't bind organic matter in soil. It doesn't stay put. Whenever it rains, it's going to follow the rain into the nearest waterway. That's where it goes. And because of that, it is the most widespread pesticide water contaminant in the United States. So this here was a study done by the USGS about 20 years ago now, but it was an enormous study. They tested over 10,000 samples from nearly 200 rivers and streams throughout the entire country, and looked for pesticides. And what they found was these top two here, atrazine and diethylatrazine, which is a metabolite of atrazine. It's a breakdown product, were by far the most widely detected pesticides throughout the entire country. And they looked at agricultural streams, they looked at urban streams near undeveloped land that is not agricultural, and then streams near mixed use land. And almost exclusively atrazine and its metabolite were the most widely detected pesticide contaminants. Maybe an exception for urban streams, but the fact that you really, there's not a lot of atrazine use in cities, the fact that we're finding it in urban streams at all is absolutely insane. So by far the biggest pesticide water contaminant, even though we use about 4 times less than glyphosate, it is orders of magnitude higher in water than what we ever find glyphosate or most other pesticides as well. So it's just, if you see a lake or stream in agricultural land, particularly in the Midwest, it has atrazine in it. You can be assured of that. So it's a very sad thing to see. And the fact that this is detecting atrazine throughout the country, not just in the Midwest, we're finding it here in the West too. Atrazine has a few other uses, like on turf and stuff like that, but it's just wherever it's used, even if it's small amounts, it's going to be found in the water. And this is reflected in a recent EPA analysis that found harmful levels of atrazine in more than 11,000 US watersheds. And so, this USGS study just looked at any level of atrazine. Now we're looking at levels of atrazine that the EPA itself says are harmful. And I will say that is a much higher level than what is really harmful. So if EPA says something is dangerous, that something really bad's happening here. So the purple and the turquoise here marks areas of the country where atrazine is present in water at dangerous levels. This covers about 1/8 of the entire landmass of the continental United States, about 250 million acres. There's no other pesticide that even comes close to that level of water contamination. So, you want to clean up the water, you got to start with atrazine. It is just absolutely terrible. So the purple here is where, the level EPA finds is harmful is anything above 9.7 parts per billion. The turquoise here is like 4 times higher than that. So this isn't just, waterways that are just a little bit above the harmful level. We're looking at, half of an order of magnitude higher than what EPA itself considers harmful, which again, I'm going to say is much higher than the science indicates. So incredibly, incredibly worrisome here. So we know where atrazine is. It's in the water. It's mostly in the Midwest, in the South. But what are the harms from atrazine? And this is where I kind of want to dive into addressing, kind of popular concerns about atrazine with what really the science says. So there's a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of it are being promoted by nincompoops like this. This is Alex Jones. He believes that atrazine is causing animals and people to be gay. Okay, this is what he believes. Actually, if you're, if you're looking for a good laugh, Google Alex Jones gay frogs, and you'll see him absolutely scream at the top of his lungs like a madman that the government is putting atrazine in our water and it's turning the frogs gay. So it would be funny if it wasn't so crazy and sad, but I will say that his crackpot theory comes from the fact that at low concentrations, very low, like a part per billion, which is about a dropper full of red, just a drop of red dye in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's the low concentrations we're talking about here. It's almost homeopathic in a way. But levels as low as like a part per billion can cause genetically male tadpoles. So these are frog embryos and tadpoles that have male genetics to develop into sterile hermaphrodites, which have both sexual organs but are sterile. And then about 10% of these frogs essentially have their testes resorb, and they develop fully functioning ovaries. And can actually mate with other male frogs and produce viable offspring. So incredibly worrisome, these studies, particularly to frog populations across the country, amphibian populations across the country, because if you're not producing any males that can reproduce, think about the population effects that could have. And I think atrazine is really turning out to be an enormous factor in amphibian decline throughout a lot of the country. So this is the science that he's using to promote his theory. However, it really doesn't take a lot to know that hermaphroditism and gender really have nothing at all whatsoever to do with sexual orientation. So that's a big swing and a miss. He's reaching, he's almost got it, but it was a big whiff. It's a cautionary tale, really, of what happens when you don't teach sex ed in schools. So the lack of understanding of basic biology can lead to something like that. So this is a false theory. It's misinformation. And I want to address this one too. So there is another theory out there which I think resonates with more people than what Alex Jones thinks, and that is that atrazine impacts gender identity. So people like Bobby Kennedy and right-wing media personalities like Tucker Carlson think that atrazine is turning kids transgender and gender nonconforming. And again, this theory comes from what I just explained to you about atrazine's effects on frog development. So the development of errant sexual organs in frogs. And again, it's hermaphroditism and gender assigned at birth, which is kind of in a lot of ways what the frog studies are looking at, really don't have anything to do with gender identity. That's a common, people misconceive that a lot. But I think it is important to just talk about this a bit and explore it a bit, because I think a lot of people equate something like lower testosterone levels or the development of multiple sexual organs as being you know, something that could impact someone's gender identity. So I want to address, you know, drawing parallels from frogs to humans, because everything I've seen about these two and the theory about atrazine, you know, causing kids to become transgender is really just based on the frog studies. And I want to caution people from putting too much, you know, faith in drawing these types of conclusions, because frogs and humans develop very, very differently. In fact, if you grow frog embryos in estradiol, which is an estrogen, they will all turn female, even the ones that are genetically male. Okay. So that's something that scientists do all the time when they're studying the effects of chemicals on frogs. Is you can have a control group where frog embryos are in water that contains estrogen, and they'll all turn female. Yet all of us humans were bathing in estrogen in the womb, regardless of our genders, regardless of our sexual orientation. In fact, you can't even conceive without estrogens. So estrogen is an absolutely essential part of all of our development. And it's really coming to conclusions about how humans develop and drawing comparisons with frogs is fraught with uncertainty and really needs to be addressed properly. And so I'm going to call strike one on this. Doesn't mean it's wrong, but you know, we got to put an asterisk when we're drawing conclusions between frogs and humans, because there's lots of differences. So let's look at where atrazine is used and where trans people are. You can see this map, this blue map over here, is where people who identify as transgender live. You know, biggest proportion is in Hawaii. Atrazine is used very little in Hawaii, and in fact, as of a few years ago, it's been banned in Hawaii. So you know, you see where trans kids live is very different than where atrazine is used. In fact, it's almost the inverse. Granted, this is not like a perfect comparison, because you really want to know where trans kids were born, because that is when, you know, exposure in the womb would happen. But at the very least, you know, you would expect to see some sort of correlation between these maps, and there's absolutely none at all. In fact, the correlation seems to be inverse. And then if you look beyond the US and look just at the world, the highest trans non-binary population is in Europe, Germany, Sweden. They haven't used atrazine for 20 years. And even before that, they didn't really use all that much of it, because Europe is not, you know, they're not exactly known for their corn. So, you know, where trans kids live and grow up and where atrazine is used, it's just really has no correlation at all. So I'm going to call strike two on that. But let's look at, you know, temporal trends. Let's see what that looks like. So in general, we know the younger you are, the more likely you are to identify as trans. The age group that has the highest proportion of people identifying as transgender is age 13 to 17. Much higher than 18 and older. So what's like 17, if you were born 17 years ago, that would be 2008, right? If you were born 13 years ago, that would be 2012. So we're looking right around here. You know, you can see it really doesn't make sense that people are identifying as trans when you have more people are identifying as trans when you have no change in atrazine use at all. In fact, there seems to be a bit of a dip around there. So the temporal trends with you know, when you would expect trans kids to be born with atrazine exposure really doesn't line up either. So, you know, I can't say with 100% certainty that atrazine isn't impacting kids' gender identity, because absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But what I can say with 100% certainty is that, you know, the available scientific data just do not support it whatsoever. And I know it can be easy to listen to someone like Bobby Kennedy talk, who's very eloquent and he speaks with authority, and say, you know, that resonates with me. That makes conceptual sense with me. But, you know, from my opinion, I think he's really shooting at the hip on this one. And I think what I'll go to show you is that there's a lot of reasons to ban atrazine. Why do we need another one? Especially one that's on such shaky scientific ground. I think these theories really do come from a place of fear. And people of a certain age, I'll include myself in that category. I'm no spring chicken anymore. But a lot of people have gone their whole lives without even knowing or hearing hearing the word transgender, knowing anyone who's come out as transgender, and now all of a sudden you're smacked with it in the face 24/7 because a political party has decided to weaponize it. And I think it's unfortunately human nature to want to make sense of that and to pathologize it and to identify conspiracy theories. But I don't think that is helpful here. I think it really, a lot of it comes from an ideology that is very anti-LGBTQ. This type of language stigmatizes an already persecuted community. And I think it delegitimizes very real fears that many of us have about atrazine. Like I said, if there's 10 reasons to ban atrazine, why do we need an 11th reason? Let's just get rid of it already, and we can ditch this completely. So what I'm going to say is moving forward, let's try and ditch the distractions. Let's focus on the science. And instead of giving you 4 hours of the science, which I could easily do because there's quite a bit of it, I'm not going to bore you like that. So, I'm just going to kind of condense a lot of scientific evidence into this one slide here so we can move on, and you don't have to fall asleep trying to listen to this. But atrazine is first and foremost an endocrine disruptor. I mean, it's not like a lot of chemicals that have maybe 1 or 2 studies that say, oh, this can impact hormonal systems. It's got dozens, hundreds even. I mean, it's just, even the EPA recognizes it as an endocrine disruptor, which again is saying a lot. So it's the poster child of an endocrine disruptor. I'd say of all of our hormonal pathways in our body, atrazine is probably impacting half of them. I mean, don't quote me on that, but it's a lot. I mean, it's hitting pathways left and right, and I think that's why we're seeing so many harms from it. I think pretty much every demonstrated effect of atrazine is rooted in its ability to muck with our hormonal systems to some extent. Atrazine is currently regulated by EPA via its ability to suppress an LH surge that happens that triggers the onset of ovulation. It is also involved in the onset of puberty as well. So that's what EPA says is the most sensitive impact from atrazine. It is an impact from atrazine. It's certainly not the most sensitive impact. If you feed mice a level of atrazine that EPA identifies as the no observable adverse effects level, the NOAEL, these mice will gain weight. They'll have reduced sperm quality. The effects are there. So EPA is not regulating atrazine based off of its most sensitive effect as it should be. It is regulating it based on an effect that it believes to be most sensitive. And California, which is often farther along on the cutting edge than EPA is, has listed atrazine as known to cause reproductive toxicity. Studies have associated atrazine exposure with many fertility issues like reduced sperm quality, irregular menses in women. So I think, the fertility impacts are clearly some of the most sensitive impacts from atrazine that we're seeing. And while fertility generally receives a lot of the focus, it's really just the tip of the iceberg because atrazine exposure is associated with things like spontaneous miscarriage, preterm birth, even birth defects like gastroschisis, which is a birth defect that happens when a child's intestines will sort of develop through their abdominal wall and basically be born with something like a hernia. And it's reversible, it's treatable, but it requires surgery. And surgery on a newborn is incredibly stressful for not only the child but for the parents as well. It's gastroschisis is increasing. It seems to be increasing in incidence, and I think the data tying atrazine to that birth defect is quite strong. And although no authoritative bodies yet consider atrazine to be a carcinogen, IARC doesn't, many governments don't. I think that's going to change. There's a recent study out of the National Cancer Institute, which is part of the NIH, done on the agricultural health study cohort, which is an enormous epidemiological study following pesticide applicators, about 90,000 pesticide applicators and their spouses throughout their life in, I believe, Iowa and North Carolina. And it follows this population. It gets, good information about what pesticides they are being exposed to and the health outcomes that they generally suffer through later in life. Study tied atrazine to increase incidence of lung cancer and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in this agricultural health study cohort. So really solid evidence. And I think in the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to be seeing a lot more people talk about atrazine's links to cancer. So, that's the human health harms. I would say the environmental harms are even worse, if that's possible. So what can we tell from the canaries in the coal mine, which are endangered species? These are species that are on the brink of extinction. Some of them only have 100 or 200 individuals left on the face of the planet. Their light is slowly being snuffed out. An EPA analysis on how atrazine is impacting endangered species across the country found that it's likely harming over 1,000. So we have about 1,700 endangered species in the US, and atrazine is harming over 50% of them. Absolutely devastating. Either directly by harming them or indirectly by, say, reducing the ability of plants to pollinate and feed, reducing the ability of plants to flower and feed pollinating insects and stuff like that. So we are really making the planet sick. And in the process, we're making ourselves sick. So how has atrazine become untouchable? Why is this pesticide that I just explained to you is harming people, is harming the environment? Why is it still around? And not only why is it still around, why do we use so darn much of it? It's because it has some of the most powerful friends in the world. Atrazine is controlled by Syngenta. I would say atrazine is not on patent anymore by any means. So any company can make pesticide products containing atrazine, but by far the market share is controlled by Syngenta, which is a Swiss-based company. They also make paraquat. Syngenta has since been acquired by the Chinese state-owned Kim China. So this has basically, keeps the trend of multinational corporations profiting from poisoning our soil, our water. Not that it would be any better if a US company was doing that. It certainly wouldn't, but it does kind of add insult to injury in a lot of ways. This company makes $2 to $3 billion every year just on the herbicides that they sell, and atrazine is their flagship product. So I would say probably about $1 billion at least of profits each year just from this one pesticide. And what is always the case has been always the case with pesticides, especially with glyphosate and paraquat and some others. We've learned a lot from class action lawsuits that have discovered and released documents, internal company strategies and memos. And that's the case with atrazine as well. So Syngenta was sued in the early 2000s by cities and municipalities that were having to deal with so much atrazine water contamination, and they wanted recompense for that. And so this led to the release of a lot of documents that we found a lot out on what Syngenta has been doing to silence critics and to promote its product. So what I'm going to go into now, most of this comes from these unsealed court documents from class action litigation brought by cities that claimed at Syngenta was polluting their water and causing them to have to get it out in some way. So, you know, a lot of ways atrazine has become untouchable is because Syngenta wins its lawsuits, win the day by any means necessary. So one of the things they decided to do was go after the judge in the case, in the class action case. You know, they wanted to dig up personal details from him, like, you know, on a dating website, he had a pick in a robe. You know, I don't know if this is a bathrobe or like a judicial robe or anything. Either way, it's kind of weird, but you know, nothing's off limits for this company. Embarrassing people, character assassination for something that has absolutely no, you know, no impact on how this person could do their job. And Syngenta hosted focus groups with managers of these water systems and discussed, oh, the financial implications. Oh, you know what, if this lawsuit goes through, you might lose tourism dollars, you know, stuff like that, giving them pressure to opt out of the class action suit. Discussed how to pressure homeowners and real estate agents to drop out of the lawsuit, saying, you know, your taxes would increase, blah, blah, blah. This lawsuit ended up settling. Syngenta had to pay about $105 million to the cities in the class action lawsuit, which